What we found is that there are inscriptions in the Sinai Peninsula, specifically at the site called Serebet el-Khadim. And in the mines, they found inscriptions which look like hieroglyphs, but we can't read them. They don't read as Egyptian at all.
That's Egyptologist David Roll talking about the discovery of ancient alphabetic inscriptions in the region of Mount Sinai.
They're all hieroglyphs, but they don't represent hieroglyphic words. They represent Hebrew words. The problem, of course, is that the time when these were written, when the alphabet was first invented, is hundreds of years before the time of Moses and the conventional dating scheme. And it has nothing, therefore, to do with the Hebrews. But in the revised dating scheme, it lines up perfectly. Most of the inscriptions in Sinai are in the time of the Exodus. And when you read them with the Hebrew language, they actually make sense. They actually refer to events recorded in the book of Exodus.
On this edition of the Humble Skeptic Podcast, I'll be discussing the Sinai inscriptions with Dr. Roll's colleague and translator, Mori Michael S.
Faith is believing in something you can't see, you can't feel, something that can't be proven.
Then how do you know which is the right faith?
I think that's a gut thing.
I don't think about a right faith. I think about what resonates with me. I feel authentic. It brings me peace.
I think there is no absolute truth in any religion. I think it's a matter of subjective experience.
I kind of just trust my intuition, trust my gut.
You just know. You just gotta follow it.
You just gotta follow what you think is your faith.
If faith is blind, then what makes one belief better or worse than any other? And if it's just a leap in the dark, why should any of us feel obligated to believe anything at all? My name is Shane Rosenthal. I was raised in a Jewish home but became an atheist at a very young age. Later, as I began to question things, I ended up losing faith in my atheism and converted to Christianity. Since that time, I've never stopped asking questions, and I've spoken with authors and scholars from all over the world in order to explore the beliefs and ideas that shape our lives. Over the years, one thing I've concluded is this: we're all believers. But because there are so many conflicting ideas and worldviews out there, we just can't all be right. So how do we find the truth? On this podcast, we'll start by asking questions.
I'm really just trying to figure out what I believe right now.
Hey there, welcome back to the Humble Skeptic Podcast. I'm Shane Rosenthal, and over the last 2 episodes, I've been featuring conversations related to the Israelite exodus from Egypt. And as I mentioned at the opening, on this program, I'll be focusing more specifically on the Sinai inscriptions that have been discovered throughout the Sinai Peninsula. My conversation partner is Mori Michael S, who is a specialist in paleo-Hebrew and who has been hard at work translating these ancient inscriptions for the better part of a decade. In fact, as a result of his detailed analysis, working with the highest quality images as well as casts of these inscriptions at Harvard University, my guest recently announced that he made an important new discovery, which has now been confirmed by other scholars in the field. Many of his findings are about to be published in a 200-page paper at academia.edu, and he recently agreed to join me for a discussion of the most important aspects of his research. Mori Michael has also had the opportunity to review the images related to the Mount Ebal curse tablet that was discovered a few years ago, and so I decided to ask him whether he could confirm or deny any of the findings that Scott Stripling and his team announced back in 2022. I also asked him questions related to a fascinating artifact that was discovered by Manfred Bitek and his team in the Great Palace at Tel Adaba. In fact, my guest argues that this particular artifact may contain images that are representative of the 12 tribes of Israel. The first question I asked Mori Michael S was how he first got interested in the study of Paleo-Hebrew.
Well, I actually come from an academic background. I have an undergrad degree from the University of California, San Diego, and I studied at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. I've always loved the field of archaeology, particularly in terms of its ramifications for the history of our people. So, of course, you're going to understand the importance of Paleo-Hebrew at some point, because beyond a certain point in history, you're simply not going to find, Hebrew in Aramaic / Assyrian script.
Right.
Even some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, you need to be able to read paleo-Hebrew to be able to study these scrolls, because that is actually our original script.
Interesting. Now, you've been working on translating various ancient inscriptions discovered in the Mount Sinai area. When were these inscriptions first discovered, and what period do you think they date to?
So they were actually discovered between 1905 all the way through 1936. That was the early period. Then you have actually another period where a few more were discovered from the 30s and the 50s. And the Darnells, who made a very, very important discovery of more proto-Sinaitic inscriptions at Wadi El Hol in Egypt proper. So basically throughout the 20th century. What was the second part of that question?
When do you think they should be dated to? What time period?
Right. Well, it seems there were a couple of periods. It doesn't seem like there's only one. Definitely several of them go back to the late 12th dynasty, the time of Pharaoh Amenemhat III.
And that's, I believe, David Rohl puts that to like the reign of Joseph.
Yes, not just David Rohl, but also according to my academic supervisor, Dr. Peter van der Veen. So a lot of people like to pin this on David Rohl, but in fact, there are several very important credentialed academics that have come to more or less the same period, such as Dr. John Bimpson and others.
At Sarabit el-Qadim, there appear to be numerous references to someone named Balat. Who is Balat, and what do some of these inscriptions say about her?
Most scholars understand that Balat is essentially this golden cow deity, the figure behind the tradition of the golden calf. In their own sources, the ancient Egyptian sources, it was served through dances through the marshes. And it's just precisely what the Exodus narrative seems to be describing. And this is basically the cult that it would have been very difficult to separate the Hebrews from.
In David Rohl's book, one of his books, he talks about the fact that the Exodus takes place at the time of year where they would have had this festival to Hathor, which is the way the Egyptians referred to this cow deity.
The story of the golden calf, when Moses comes down the mountain and he finds these people all sleeping around the golden calf because they've been drunk all night and dancing and God knows what else, that is exactly the same date time-wise as the celebration of the Festival of Drunkenness, which was a festival in Egypt to celebrate the golden goddess Hathor. The very same day that festival took place in Egypt was the day in which Moses found these people all drunk, lying about, sleeping about at the bottom of the mountain of God. So basically, the story of the golden calf is all about Hathor. And of course, you have the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel, who actually says, I am making these two heifers, these two statues for you, so you can worship the God who brought you out of Egypt. And that's why they make the golden calf, because they're worshipping Hathor, basically.
Do you subscribe to his view there? Are you familiar with the idea that I'm talking about?
Very much. It really goes back, and this is actually an answer to your previous question. It's very clear that this was happening in the latter 12th through 13th dynasties. According to our understanding, based on a wealth of sources, that really seems to be what we would call the Israelite period, or what academia looks at as the Hyksos period. And it's very clear, that there's a distinct group that we can postulate with confidence what the Torah is speaking of the early Israelites during the time of the sojourn.
The view presented by David Rohl and throughout his literature, it seems clear that there is this explosive expansion of Semites in Egypt before the Hyksos take over. And, when you look at the Brooklyn Papyrus, you see Israelite names, Asher, Issachar, I think even Yaakov is in there.
As I understand it, most scholars date the Brooklyn Papyrus, the slave papyrus, with those names that you mentioned, to the Middle Kingdom period. They don't date it to the Ramesside period, the 19th dynasty. And there is just so much evidence that very strong evidence that time period needs to be moved forward, through archaeoastronomy. And, today we have, physics-based evidence for the reigns of particular pharaohs. And it's no longer so much, guesswork. That's really the way that it was until the last 15 years or so.
I asked you earlier about Baalat, and I'd like you to tell me about some of the inscriptions that have been found that reference her. What do they say?
Right. So actually, you don't just have one type of inscription there. Okay, you actually have two groups. Those who worship Baalat, and so you have inscriptions that are votive, meaning these would accompany a sacrifice that was given for this deity, who is essentially, by the way, the ancient Egyptian version of Aphrodite, Venus, the sex goddess, just their version of it. So, for example, the Cerebite Sphinx, along its paws, you have, in Hebrew, Me'uhab alenu da uda leba'alat, which essentially means, beloved for us is this, and this is for Baalat. And it is this very, very nicely made sphinx. You have other inscriptions that are simpler. One that just simply says that this is for Baalat. And then you have other inscriptions that are very clearly coming to absolutely demolish the Baalat cult. One of them, of which my reading of this is already quite well known, lo, I cut down the gate of the accursed one. Gone is the value of those belonging to Baalat, those who follow Baalat. Give answer to our brethren for shame, Boshat. They have committed sin.
Wow. Is there a general consensus right now in the world of, ancient linguists that all these inscriptions are paleo-Hebrew?
None of them are what would be called paleo-Hebrew, technically. Okay, they are what's called proto-Sinaitic. Sometimes people call them proto-Alphabetic. I actually have another mentor, and he is literally the scholar who wrote the textbook. He literally wrote the book, on these inscriptions, and that is Dr. Ludwig Morenz at the University of Bonn. And he likes to call it proto-Alphabetic. I love that.
Yeah. It's not a coincidence that you have an alphabet in Hebrew and an alpha beta in Greek and an alphabet in English.
It's the foundation of all phonetic alphabets.
I recently saw, maybe a year ago or so, I saw a PBS documentary on the development of the alphabetic script, and they hardly even mentioned the connection to Israel.
It's sad, and this is one of the things that the grievance that I brought to Dr. Morenz, and that is, why can't they bring Israel into it? Why can't they mention some sort of a connection?
Right.
And instead they use the word Canaanite, Proto-Phoenician, but it's very clear, and there is a fair consensus on this, that this was the first stage. Now, the mark of quality scholarship is when we change our mind in light of further evidence. Anyone who remains static in this field is definitely wrong. We're all wrong. I'm also wrong. That's very important. These are very faint inscriptions. None of the people working on them are idiots.
Right.
And it is impossible that I am correct on everything. Whoever does not approach this field with that kind of an attitude, that's not somebody to take very much stock in their work.
Right.
So when you do this kind of work, you need to have two principles that always guide you. Number one is Occam's razor, which is the simplest explanation is generally the preferred one. And Sagan's razor, which is, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. There are all kinds of, possibilities of what these mean. What I do in my work is I show the glyphs that anybody can see. Okay, in another color, those lines and glyphs that can be seen if you have high resolution images or have worked with the casts, themselves or the originals, which I have in most cases. I actually have been working on them for 8 years. And I say this very humbly, but I believe that some of the high-res images that I myself photographed of these original casts that are in the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Middle East, you simply see elements there that nobody else has noticed. And what you do, of course, is you have to use what's called shifting light. As you move these casts, or sometimes they're the original stones, in the light. Anyone who hasn't worked with the casts in that way, you're just looking at a photograph and you haven't even seen, different angles of it, it's not very strong.
Yeah. You point out that in Sinai 353, the words, "be ashamed of the very name of Baalat," is very similar to Exodus 23:13, which says, "make no mention of the name of the other gods." So there does seem to be a correspondence there, doesn't there?
Yes, indeed. And actually, I have in my proto-thesis, it's just going to come up in just a few weeks from now, and it will be up on academia.edu for the wide public. There's actually a section in there on the historicity of Moses. And besides bringing so many sources that really suggest the historicity of this individual, I also have within there all of these points in common from the core biblical narrative, what is written about Moses, and what can be understood from these inscriptions.
Earlier, you referenced getting really high-quality scans and also 3D casts from Harvard. And as a result of that detailed analysis, you made some news recently when you discovered something no one had seen before on Sinai 361. Talk about that.
It wasn't just Sinai 361. It was also Sinai 357. So what you have there are attributions to a certain Moshe. By the way, it was very possible that in those days, Moshe, as we know him in Hebrew, may actually have been known as Musi or Masu.
For my English hearers, you're referring to Moses.
Moses, indeed. Yes, you have attributions to Moses. So, first of all, 357, after I have corrected myself on so much, that reading really seems to be very solid. And it means, lo, I root out an oppressed garden. I understand that probably to be Egypt. But whatever the exact reading of it is, to its right, and a little bit slanting away from it, you have Zot mi Moshe. Zot mi Moshe. This is from Moses. And one of the most gratifying things that a scholar can have is when his academic supervisor, a full professor at a very minimalist institution, University of Mines, actually on my Facebook page, he actually writes in there, "You're absolutely correct. I read this as well. It is not imagined."
You note in one of your papers that you disagree at various points with Douglas Petrovich, and he's translated many of the Sinai inscriptions in his book, Hebrew, the World's Oldest Alphabet. And as I read through his book, many of the translations are completely different from those that you have provided. So in light of the different possible readings, how and why should a non-specialist have confidence in one particular translation, given that the specialists themselves have widely divergent translations?
So I don't know what Douglas Petrovich's readings are now, okay? I feel so bad because I don't like to make this into some kind of a competition. But in general, the reads that are brought in my proto-thesis are, a hands-on perspective using the best materials, actually working with, original inscriptions, original casts. And by the way, sometimes the casts are better than the originals because the originals have some wear and the casts are so precise. Also distinguishing the clear letters, different levels of clarity, and also honest, active responsiveness to critique. Like I said earlier, anyone who does not change their mind over time, it is humanly impossible to arrive at precision when it comes to these things. And I'd be very glad to be corrected. But I've heard two different sources that Dr. Petrovich is saying that he had the Holy Spirit come upon him and that these inscriptions, his readings are Holy Spirit. And what I would invite anyone to do is also in my old and very imperfect proto paper from 2021, see what I've written on 375a, where you have give joy to Baalat, but there's no strength, okay? If you look at the actual maddening complexity of the surface of the stone, and I actually show, with little tiny arrow lines, all sorts of lines there that can confuse. And the simplicity of, how he understood that inscription in his book, I think that anybody can see that it's just not convincing.
Yeah, and that's a different approach to say, I have a good argument based on my study of the epigraphy versus I'm confident because I'm filled with the Holy Spirit.
Well, first of all, any translation is by definition an interpretation and a commentary.
Right.
Okay. And anytime that you translate from one language to another, it is in so many cases just impossible to make a precise translation because, languages are different minds, different mindsets about time, different mindsets about the universe. And that's very important to understand. So not everybody needs to be a Hebraist. It's not that everyone needs to go learn Hebrew. But when you read something that is supposed to be a translation, okay, just understand that that's imperfect.
Yeah. I had a Greek professor once who said that translation isn't like math. It's more like an art. And definitely over the years, that has really resonated with me. It's an art that has to be developed over time as you study culture, just think about the way we, you refer to the Iron Curtain. It doesn't convey anything about Russia.
Yes.
But behind the Iron Curtain to us is clear because of the way that phrase was used. And if that gets forgotten, what are people going to think of the phrase 2,000 years from now?
Yes, and that actually brings me to another insight, and that is that I find some of these translations so reaching, and clearly anybody from any background, you're going to be bringing in some bias.
Certainly.
I simply declare that bias.
Now, speaking of differences of interpretation, at one point you translated Sinai 361 as the enslaver has been removed. Then the year ended, and ended were those who strayed toward Baalat. But I believe you later retracted that. Is that correct?
Indeed. And later when I actually studied the cast, I saw that I was so wrong. I just went completely back to the drawing board. And that inscription, and I intend to build up some hype here, okay, is the most magnificent and the most extraordinary of these mosaic type inscriptions. I actually think that the images that I have taken at Harvard are probably the best in the world. And you see on it, all across the top, Ha'el, the God, describing him as King, Melech. And you literally have, to my humble reading, a prayer to God to destroy the Baalat. It's very, very extraordinary.
Wow.
So you just have to work with everything, and you need to try not to see Moses. You need to try not to understand these things in a biblical context. Otherwise, you are just simply allowing your own bias to take you over.
Yeah, confirmation bias is a real thing that needs to be, avoided at all costs.
Yeah, you need to look for someone who is not trying to convince the believer, but someone who is trying to bring this to the most critical scholars that there are in the ivory tower.
Excellent. You've written a lot of pieces over at academia.edu, which I'll link to, but you also have a GoFundMe page if people want to contribute to your scholarly research. What's the page that we should click on?
My GoFundMe page is gofundme.com/Exodus-tablets.
Exodus-tablets.
It's called Help Support My MA PhD Research. Nobody is getting rich from this work. It is the labor of love. So anyone who would like to be a part of this incredible project, you have a great opportunity to do so. And it's greatly appreciated.
Now I'd like to switch to another paper that you wrote that I was fascinated with a few years ago, and that was related to your interpretation of an artifact that was found at the Tel Adaba location by Manfred Bitek and his team. It's a cylinder that you argue belongs to the family of Joseph. So talk about that, and what's your interpretation of that particular cylinder seal?
Yeah, so it's a very exciting early achievement of mine back from 2017. And essentially it is in this palace garden, you have 12 stately tombs, and 11 of them are very quintessential Semitic tombs. They are arched. The bones were found in fetal position. For those who are in the field, they know that this is, classic Semitic, Asiatic, what we would call Hebrew burials. 12 stately tombs, and one of them is a pyramid tomb. So among those ruins, you have a cylinder seal with all sorts of glyphs on it. And I see it as a cylinder seal of whoever was the head or the high official of that house. So you have there symbols of the 12 tribes that we not only would intuitively understand from the blessings of Jacob and later the blessings of Moses in Deuteronomy, but also from Jewish tradition.
Yeah, one of the things that you point out is that the various images on the cylinder seal seem to match what we find in Genesis and Deuteronomy. So, for example, Joseph in Deuteronomy 33:17 is depicted as a bull, and Reuben as unstable water, Levi a bird of prey, and Judah as the lion. Most people are probably familiar with that one, the Lion of Judah. Dan is depicted as a serpent. So what you have on this cylinder seal is this preeminent bull standing above unstable water. Now, in Genesis 49, Reuben is actually told, you shall not have preeminence. He was the firstborn son, and the image of unstable water is underneath the bull. The third image on the cylinder seal is the bird of prey. Underneath that, the fourth image is the lion, and underneath that is the snake. It just seems like there's so many connections. Number one, the order. Number two, the symbols matching, as you say, Genesis and Deuteronomy. What other connections do you make between the images on the cylinder and the Torah?
So over time, I've actually found even more connections. Like, for example, the third, which is, this bird of prey, I link to Levi, the third son. And that's strong because just underneath him is going to be the lion, who I would call the Lion of Judah, who is the fourth son. And then just beneath that, you actually have the serpent, who we would associate with Dan, who is the fifth son.
One of the most interesting aspects of the cylinder seal, from my perspective, is the depiction of the lion, which appears below the bird of prey and above the serpent. Again, in Genesis and Deuteronomy, Levi is depicted as a bird of prey, Judah as a lion, and Dan as a serpent. They were born in that order and also happen to appear in that same order on this cylinder seal. Furthermore, according to Genesis 49, when Jacob blessed his son Judah, he described him as a crouching lion and said that, quote, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his." What's particularly striking about the cylinder seal is that not only is the lion presented in a crouching position, but his tail, in my humble opinion, is presented in the shape of a shepherd's staff. If you'd like to check it out for yourself, I've included an image of the cylinder seal in the show notes. Another curious feature of this artifact is that it also appears to include an image of God. In her study of the cylinder, Edith Parada concluded that the image of a man striding above two mountain peaks was likely to be seen as the seal owner's patron deity, and should be identified either as the Syrian storm god Baal or the Canaanite god El. This makes sense in light of the fact that a rope connects the divine figure to the image of the bull. But if the seal really did belong to Joseph, who is represented by the bull, then what we have is an extremely unusual artifact, since from the time of Moses and beyond, Israelites were actually prohibited from creating images of God.
What you see very clearly in that image is what I would say is, El, striding above the mountains. And, he has a mallet in one of his arms, and he is what we see in the Song of the Sea. Hashem ish milchama. God is a man of war. And he is striding above what would make very good sense in a Joseph context as over Shechem, between the mountain of Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. And remember, that is the crown, the inheritance of Yaakov, which was given to Joseph. So that's very strong.
You know, that figure there is also standing over, as you say, the two mounds. But one place in your article, you suggest that this could be alluding to the fact that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to Joseph's father on one auspicious occasion in Genesis 28, standing on the great staircase. On those mounds, you have what appears to be like ladders. And I don't know, I kind of think that's another possible interpretation of the image that, if this is Joseph, that would have been one of the key events in the family's memory in which God revealed himself to the patriarch Jacob. And I don't know, I kind of see ladders on the mounds there. What do you think?
Yeah, I would disagree. Simply because you just have a crisscross of them both. Remember, this is something very tiny. It's very, very small. So what seems to be happening is kind of like the equivalent of these hills being colored in. So I would consider that to be more speculative, but who knows?
All right. You also had a chance to look at the images of the Mount Ebal curse tablet yourself. So what do you think? Can you confirm the team's findings?
Yes. And I just have to put this out there that I'm just deeply frustrated with the slow pace in which things have come out. And I myself, when the news came out and I just tried to look at some of the images initially, even that my professor sent me when I asked for them, I tried and just couldn't make out anything. And then I had this beautiful conference with him, and I actually have it saved. It's like one of these great moments where he showed me, again, I was really new to the field, and how to look at this like an MRI, I would say, how to look three-dimensionally. And then I really saw some of these elements. And what you basically have, to my humble reading, are instances of the tetragrammaton, Yod, He, and Waw, the name of God, and Arur, Aleph, Resh, Resh, and Tamut, which is To, Mem, To, which means it could be understood, you shall die. I understand it to be, she shall die. Every single thing about that little object screams out a scrap from an adulterous trial ceremony, what we call in Hebrew the sotah. The sotah is the woman suspected of adultery. And actually, contra people of a feminist perspective who would think this to be something very, very shameful, to a woman suspected of adultery, it's very clear that in wider context, this was a way to try to save the woman. In other words, the entire ceremony, I don't want to get too much into theologics, but it was really a way to also shame the husband, just in case it wouldn't turn out that she's an adulteress. But really the key is that it's lead. And if this were a scrap from a sota ceremony, first of all, mixing it into water and making her drink would give her, a weak enough of an amount of lead that would cause her to abort if she were carrying a child. And this is known, and this is a medical fact, that lead poisoning causes a miscarriage. I was permitted to put out a very proto paper on academia.edu of my understanding of what I'm explaining to you right now. And actually my contributions will be included in the group's second stage paper. And that is a great honor.
Now, in one of the press releases, the team claimed to be able to read the sentence, cursed by the god Yahu, which is the ancient form of the Tetragrammaton. And God there would have been El, so you'd have both of the ancient forms of the name of God there in one text, much earlier than people had surmised.
Actually, you have even more evidence. For example, there is a trilateral, which is a fancy word for a three-sided obelisk, which is confidently dated to the latter 12th dynasty, okay? That's essentially to the Middle Kingdom period, where you have names of rulers in the Levant and the land of Canaan. And you have one who is called Yashi, like the same name of David's father, okay? And you have Yanaam, which would have meant God says. This is in Egyptian, it's not in proto-Sinaitic. So you actually have, these theophoric names, which has that Yah element. That's very real. But you do not see it in any of the inscriptions. And that makes really good sense in an Egyptological perspective. For example, there is an Egyptian tomb, okay? I think it's the tomb of Djoser, I'm not sure, but it actually reads like this. It is Pharaoh who weighs what he says, together with him whose name is hidden. He whose name is hidden. So the idea of a deity whose name is known to the priests, but not something that is, made widespread, goes all the way back. And to actually bring this to the inscriptions, we do see a hint of this as well in Sinai 358. And this is a reading that everybody reads. I mean, for almost a century, the great epigraphers of the past, everybody reads this. El De'elem, which means God of the hidden, or the hidden God. And at the bottom of it, there's an acrostic. And some of these work like, crossword puzzle. You also have Melech, king. If you would go to that cave, and it's incredible because it is just a very short distance. It's literally in the mine that's right next to and connected to 357, the manna inscription. It says very clearly, God of the hidden or the hidden God. And you have like obliterated there a symbol of the Baalat cult. And again, this is something you find in a number of those inscriptions. So it's not just something being imposed on the inscription. Most of these inscriptions, if you were just to write them in a modern, Hebrew font, certainly if, with spaces, according to my reading, any young yeshiva kid would be able to read it.
Interesting. Is it read like traditional Hebrew, modern Hebrew, from right to left or left to right, or both?
So it's really cool is that actually in these inscriptions, you really see what seems to be this development of writing right to left. And you also see the beginnings of those who write left to right. For example, you kind of have roughly those who are for Baalat are writing left to right. And generally those who are, writing for El, generally speaking, they're writing right to left. The others are written in columns. And that's simply taken from ancient Egyptian. Because in ancient Egypt, you could write either way, either of three ways. You could write left to right to left, top to down, and you could even read Boustrophedon in a circle.
Last question. I think in Petrovich's book, he argued that some of the inscriptions went back to the time of Joseph. I think he claimed to have found one that referred to Asenath, Joseph's wife. What do you think about those claims?
I see absolutely nothing suggesting Asenath in those. He is right. There's definitely inscriptions that go back to the time of Amenemhat III, that we definitely associate that with the time of Joseph. Now, where you find mention of Asenath that anybody can read who knows Egyptian hieroglyphs is actually the stele of Reni Seneb, which is going to be shown and translated in my proto-thesis. And that's something that seems to bring Anhu, who we understand to be the biblical Joseph, to life. And, he's seated next to his wife. He's not just Anhu, but he has a wife whose name is Senet or Asenat. But Sinai 350, is so dramatic. And Dr. Ludwig Morenz is the one who showed this to me, where you have a logogram, which basically is like a Semitic form of the cartouche of the pharaoh. And one of these, and what makes Sinai 350 so extraordinary, is that it has this logogram done by a very fine hand that Dr. Morenz understands to be two cartouches combined, a pharaoh Amenemhat III. And you have something that is praising El. And this is, again, according to glyphs that are agreed upon between my own small self and Dr. Ludwig Morenz. And it's communicating, to my humble understanding, to my reading, the compassion of El. And this is what's so beautiful about it, is that, you actually have an inscription that seems to be saying, to my humble reading, basically, El brings close a daughter who offers love. And in the corner of it, you have this logogram of Pharaoh Amenemhat III. And I explained in my proto-thesis why this could suggest an official who's clearly a Semite writing for Semites who might represent, the administration. So that's very profound.
Wow. So as we take a step back and look at the land we've surveyed thus far, you have proto-alphabetic inscriptions in the Sinai area, some of which mention El, and some reference a cow deity, some referencing manna, some referencing Moses.
One that seems to mention manna.
One that references manna, but more than one that references Moses?
Two, to my humble understanding, amidst a clade of 7 that may have the same author, having multiple links between them, not only in terms of the wordings, but even little epigraphic details of the hand that wrote them.
Very, very interesting. Mori Michael Baron, thank you so much for spending time with us to talk about your research. And again, I will include links so that people can read your articles and find your GoFundMe page.
You are most welcome. Thank you so much.
Well, folks, thanks for joining me for this edition of the Humble Skeptic Podcast. If you'd like more information about the Sinai Inscriptions, the Mount Ebal Curse Tablet, or the Seal of Joseph, you can find articles by Michael Baron and others in the show notes, along with other helpful resources, including images that I refer to of the cylinder seal itself. The web address is humbleskeptic.com. That's humbleskeptic.com. And I look forward to being with you again next time as we discuss the beliefs and ideas that shape our lives.